Hello friends, Eli here with Mystic Circuits. Today we are building another kit. This is probably one of the easiest ones that I offer for the attenuator, which is the dual attenuator. You might hear some noises in the background. It's because me and all my roommates are stuck together on quarantine. So sorry if it's distracting, but I don't want to tell them to be quiet, you know? We're all bored in here. So yeah. You should get a bag that looks something like this. Just go ahead and dump out all the stuff. Alright. You can see here already we don't have a ton of parts, so we're off to a good start. If any of you don't know how to solder, now's a good time to check out our video on the basics of soldering. It'll go over some sort of techniques to making sure this all goes smoothly, and you know, chances are you might be a beginner doing this. This is a very beginner friendly kit. There's literally, you know, what, 8 things you have to solder? Not very difficult. So if you're a beginner, go ahead and check out our how to solder video. It's linked in the description. But for the rest of you, we're going to go ahead and get started. So got my iron right here. I'm turning up the heat, and I'm going to go ahead and tin it. This is how we should always start with soldering. Just make sure the tip is nice and shiny and that solder's flowing on it. Clean it off. Shiny tip. Clean it off. Alright, I'm going to put it away for a sec. Now you've got 2 resistors that are not labeled because they are both the same value. So we're going to take off the little paper tabs. You should have them each individually. You bend them over into like a U shape. Alright. And now, if you look on here, I've got to kind of manually do the manual autofocus. Ironic, right? So there's these 2 smaller rectangles next to the larger rectangles. See this rectangle right here, that rectangle right there. That's where your resistors are going to go. So kind of put your resistor in there, push it down. Do a second one. Push it down. Okay, so your board should look more or less like this so far. 2 resistors in those smaller rectangles on the back. I just sort of like, you didn't see it, but I just bent the legs in opposite directions just to keep the resistors in the board. You can see I can shake it around now and they're not going anywhere. Another thing to note is that you don't want, let's see if I can get a good view here. It's hard sometimes when it's reflecting. That's pretty good. So you don't want your leg to necessarily be covering up one of these other holes, right? And the reason for that is when you're soldering, it's really easy to accidentally get solder into a hole that isn't filled yet. So what you kind of want to do is aim the legs away from anything else, and that way it's a lot easier to get the solder just on the joint that you're trying to make and not anywhere else. So I'll try and show you more or less what that looks like, and for this I might actually zoom in a little bit. Alright, so we got this. Okay, so take our iron. It's always good when your iron has been sitting for a sec just to tin it really fast. Doesn't have to be quite as thorough as before. And what you're going to want to do, you want to put the iron sideways against the point that you're trying to solder, and then you're kind of holding it still, right? And you can see my iron isn't touching this hole. It's not touching that hole because I could accidentally fill one of those holes with solder if I'm doing that. I'm just touching this joint with the iron, and then I touch a little bit of solder on there, and that should make a nice solid joint. Alright, we're going to do all the other ones before we check it. So again, trying to get the iron just on the joint that I'm making, not touching the other ones as much as possible. So if we take a closer look, you can see these joints. And the way that I always check to make sure that I have a strong solder connection is when you wiggle this little silver dot shouldn't move around at all. So you've got almost like a Hershey's Kiss kind of shape sticking out of the leg, and when you move this, that Hershey's Kiss is completely immobile. Right? Looking good. Now, you should have a wire cutter or something similar. And you're going to cut off those little legs. Pro tip, if you're absolutely in a tough spot, you can use nail clippers, but a wire cutter is going to be a lot friendlier. Alright, so this is what it should look like on the bottom. This is what it should look like on the top. So far so good. Now, you might be tempted to put these in first, but trust me, it's a lot easier to solder the jacks if we do the jacks first. So you'll notice that the jack has a little sideways tab on it. I'm sorry for the frantic focusing and refocusing. It's just the easiest way to do this. So you'll see there's a little tab on the side and there's a little hole on the side. So it's only going to fit if you do it in one direction. Obviously the jack will be facing out of the board. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and put all 4 jacks in there. Now, unlike a lot of the others, this is what it should look like once you're done. Like this. That's what it should look like on the bottom. Now, unlike a lot of the other 0 HP modules, this module has normalized jacks, and what that means is when nothing is plugged in, it makes a little switch inside the jack that makes a connection. So you need to solder all of these joints. I'm just going to turn my phone off for a second. So we are going to solder all of these joints, and how that looks is if you have an iron that has adjustable heat, I would turn the heat up just a little bit, not a whole lot, but it helps a lot with soldering these larger lugs, they're called. Now you can see there's sort of a flat section. It's like a little semicircle, like pill-shaped oblong kind of thing. You want your iron to lay flat against it. That way it transfers as much heat into the lug as possible. And then you just touch it with the solder and go on to the next one. I like to do all of the lugs that are facing the same direction at once, and then I rotate the board and do the other ones. It just makes things faster because, you know, I have to solder a lot of these together sometimes. Alright. Alright, so far so good. Rotate 90 degrees and do these other ones. Cool. So you should see it's kind of a little mountain of solder on each of these joints, and they're looking pretty solid. I'd say a good indication that you've made a good connection is that the hole that was there is no longer visible, so it's completely filled with solder, and there's no like little, you see how the solder is nice and smoothly flowing out to the sides, right, like that. There isn't like a ball of solder sitting on the top, so you can tell there's a good connection between the lug and the circuit board, and yeah, that should be good. So now we can do the what are called the potentiometers, or the knobs, basically. So you'll see here where the knobs go, there are 2 large holes and 3 small holes. And you'll notice on the knob there's 3 small pins and 2 large pins. The large pins are basically just there to keep it in place. So what you need to do is you need to sort of pinch them together like that, because they're made to be a little bit too wide so that there's some contact between the holes. And then you put the 3 small holes in, put the 2 large holes in, and you might have to pinch them more than once. Try not to pinch them too much, but if you do, just bend them back in the other direction. It's not such a big deal. And then, come on, there you go. See? It's sticking out like a champ. Alright. Do the second one. Cooperate with me, knob. Wow. Oh, looks like it got a little bit of solder in there. Yeah, so what you can do, I don't know if this is going to show up on the camera, but for those of you that might have gotten a little solder in the hole, there are sort of fancy ways to get it out. Having some solder braid around is definitely really helpful. I also have one of these solder sucker things. This is probably the best soldering investment I've ever made. But if you just have a little bit in there, you can probably get away with just using your iron and kind of push it in there and kind of push the solder against the sides a little bit. I realize this is going to be difficult for you to follow at home, but hopefully that'll do the trick. If not, I'll have to use some braid. Jeez. Alright, so hopefully that worked. Let's see. Yep, very nice. Yeah, so in case it didn't show up right, it's kind of hard for me to watch the camera and also like point a 350-degree iron at my hand. But basically I just put the iron into this hole and like rotated it in order to push the solder against the sides. If you have to do that, best of luck. So now both of our knobs are connected, and what we're going to do, for those of you who have followed my instructions before probably know, I'm going to turn the heat back to its normal level. What I like to do when soldering one of these is I'll solder one pin on one side of the pot, and then I'll solder the big lug on the other side. And what that lets me do is it lets me double check that the pots are flat before I solder everything else in. So looks like nothing's moving around, everything's fine. I'm going to solder these other pins. Very cool. Alright, so that's the end of the soldering for this, as you can tell. It was not so bad. Not too difficult. And, yeah, so we're looking good. Now we're going to attach the back panel. These are the standoffs for the device, and as you can tell, as you should hopefully be able to tell, they're different on each side. So one side is a little bit smoother on the nubs, and this side is a little bit more jagged on the nubs. If you can't tell the difference, maybe just try grabbing one, pause the video here, and just look at it until it sort of matches what you're seeing on the screen. This smoother side goes into the circuit board, and then this more jagged side goes into the acrylic back plate. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the smooth side, stick it into the circuit board. You can see the jagged side is sticking out at the end. smooth side, smooth side, smooth side, and now you should have sort of like 4 legs sticking out of the bottom. Alright, now you're going to take your panel. I like to make it so you can read it, so I'll make sure I can read it and then do 180, right, because it's going to be the opposite direction of how you're reading it. And then you line up the 4 posts, and now this usually requires standing up, so it's going to be, it's going to take some, gorilla strength in order to do this, because you don't want to break the panel, right? So use both thumbs and just push in. You should hear a click, and now all 4 legs are in like that, and you're done. Look at that thing, isn't it pretty? So yeah, if you have any questions, go ahead and leave a comment. There is a Muff Wiggler thread in the DIY forum, which I'll link to, or you can send me an email through my website. Hopefully this was easy enough that it was not too bad to follow along. Yeah, I hope you are all having a wonderful day, and until next time, I'll catch you later. Meow.